words, there's likely to be some variation from one state to another in regard to the likelihood that they will engage in free trade, which will depend in part on the nature of their political institutions. From that point of view, generally, analysts would predict that states with a unitary form of government based on proportional representation would be much more likely to engage in free trade than states that are based on an electoral system consisting of single-member constituencies. Why? For those of you not familiar with proportional representation in single-member constituencies, you probably should be, but single-member constituencies are systems like that of the United States, like that of Canada, in which you have ridings or voting districts. In other words, the whole country is divided into equal districts, roughly equal districts. Each district elects a person to represent that district, and they go into the parliament. Proportional representation systems are based on a kind of party dominance, meaning that you do not vote for individuals in individual voting districts. You vote as a country as a whole for a particular party that you support. And the party and the makeup of the parliament depends on the percentage of votes that a particular party gets, and each party puts together a list of, there's 400 seats in the parliament, 400 names. If they get 25% of the vote, that means they get 100 of those seats, and that means that names from 1 through 100 on their party list are members of parliament. What that entails, however, is a very different form of representation. Proportional representation is an ideological form of representation, or a form of party representation, in which the role of the individual in the parliament is to represent that particular ideology and to support that party. Single-member constituency systems, implicitly, if not explicitly, depend on regional representation. In other words, the job of the representative in parliament is to represent his constituency, not his political party. Now, there's some variations in this regard. So, for example, in the case of Canada, Canada kind of falls in between. And one reason for that is that the naming of candidates in the individual single-member constituency ridings depends on the leadership of the various parties. So the parties do control their members. In the United States, by contrast, the Republican Party does not choose who runs from different ridings. It's all determined within those ridings or within those voting districts by primaries, primary elections. And that means that members of the House of Representatives in particular know precisely where their bread is buttered. And their bread is not buttered by their party leaders in the House of Representatives or by the President in the White House. Whether they get reelected or not will have nothing to do with how pissed off the President or the party whip or the party leader in Congress is. It will have to do with the perception of their constituents. Did this person bring enough of the tax dollars that we sent to Washington back to their districts? Meaning that they very unambiguously represent their districts, not their parties. And for that reason, in the American Congress, strict party votes are very, very rare. Parties very rarely vote in a single voice. It happens on occasion. It's been happening a bit more because of the extensive polarization between Democrats and Republicans currently, but that's a rather exceptional circumstance in American history. Insofar as states or members of a legislature represent a single voting district, they're likely to be tied to the particularistic interest of that district. And therefore, that district is a district that produces primarily dairy products. They're going to be very strongly inclined to supporting protectionist measures to keep European cheese goods out of the American market, for example. The United States does that very effectively. There are very few European cheeses available in the United States. In large part, Canada is under similar restriction to some extent because they do not allow the sale of any unpasteurized milk products. Almost all European cheeses are made from unpasteurized milk that can't be sold in the American market, and this is something that the Europeans are upset about. And this is one of the topics that's up for negotiation in the North American-European Free Trade Agreement that the Harper government is currently negotiating with Europe. Basically, single-member constituency systems are much more likely to be protectionist because they are tied to those particular interests, and therefore represent those particular interests, and not the general interest of the society as a whole. States that are or governments that are elected by proportional representation, on the other hand, are much more free to ignore those particular interests and to focus on the general interest, and for that reason can be expected to be somewhat more prone toward free trade. This manifests itself in the United States in particular in the difference between the President and Congress. Congress has traditionally always been extremely protectionist for the reasons that I just cited. They are tied to the various industries that dominate their individual interests, and therefore strongly favor protectionism. The President, on the other hand, is elected by the entire society as a whole, and is therefore not tied to those particular interests as much. And for that reason is much more likely to push for free trade measures. Now, traditionally, in the United States, and I don't want to give you a lecture on American politics so much, but under the US Constitution, trade is under the authority of Congress, not under the authority of the President. And for that reason, the United States has historically, up until the end of the First World War, been one of the most protectionist countries on the planet. There's more complicated reasons for that too that I'll talk about in a few more minutes. But that began to change in the 1930s, particularly after the Second World War. It began to change first and foremost, and most importantly, in 1934, when Congress took a unique step in supporting the New Deal legislation of the government of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of granting the President what became known as fast-track authority. Meaning that Congress abdicated its responsibility to regulate trade in the complex environment of the 1930s, and argued it's better for the President to negotiate free trade agreements, and for him simply to pass those trade agreements on to Congress to vote for either in favor or against. That's a big difference from how trade was usually regulated in Congress itself. In Congress, trade bills generally took the form of omnibus bills, meaning that whenever any bill passes through Congress, every single member of Congress says, okay, what's in it for me? And if there's nothing in it for me, okay, let me attach something to give me a reason to vote for it. And that means that, okay, you want tariff restrictions on dairy imports? Well, I'm from a tobacco farming state. I have no interest in that. So what's in it for me? If you want protections for dairy products, then we want protections for tobacco. And the other person wants protection for sugar, and so on and so forth. And what comes out of that is usually a fairly extensive mishmash of different protectionist measures. By the President taking that over and presenting merely a vote up or a vote down, it takes it out of the responsibility of individual legislators and essentially allows for a greater focus on the common interests of the American public as a whole, as opposed to the particular interests of individual producers. And consequently, most of the free trade agreements that have been signed, and indeed the entire free trade infrastructure that has developed since the Second World War, has been developed under presidential dominance, with Congress increasingly playing a more and more trivial role. Another institutional variable that strongly influences the behavior of states are the nature of the organization of different interests. And here the most prominent example of this is that of the organization of labor unions. The big difference in this regard can be noted in comparing European labor organization to that of North America, in particular the United States, but Canada follows very closely in the line with the policies of the United States. In Canada today, only roughly 16% of the workforce are members of labor unions. In Europe, the percentage is far, far higher. Furthermore, in most European countries, labor unions are federated into national organizations. And through complex mechanisms often referred to as corporatism, are included in the decision-making process of formulating economic policy. That means they are far stronger as entities than they are in the United States. In the United States, labor unions are to a large extent industry or organized by industry, not across industry, and labor union membership in general is far lower. What does that mean in terms of trade? Well, this basically means that labor is able to defend its interests to a far greater extent in Europe than it is in North America. And again, there are more complex reasons than merely trade that we can, in this respect. But one of the best examples to illustrate this dynamic is to compare Germany and the United States, and in particular with regard to their participation in globalization. In the United States, the perception is that globalization, the relaxing of trade through NAFTA and various other free trade arrangements, in particular since the 1970s, has had a drastic impact in pushing down wages, in lowering, in particular, the wages of unskilled workers. Wages for unskilled workers, indeed the wages for workers in the United States as a whole, have stagnated since the 1970s. And given the amount of inflation, have therefore actually diminished rather substantially. One economic report that I was reading last week calculated what the minimum wage today would be if the minimum wage had been adjusted to inflation in the United States consistently since the 1960s, and came to the conclusion that it would be somewhere around $20 an hour. They're currently having extensive debates in the United States about raising it from $7 an hour to $10.10 an hour, which Mr. Obama has just unilaterally imposed on employees of government contractors as an example for the rest of the economy. Labor has indeed been hurt by free trade, but not necessarily by free trade, but rather by the shape that free trade has taken. Germany, by contrast, has been every bit as globalized in terms of its economy, if not more so, than is the case of the United States. Indeed, in the case of Germany, as a percentage of its GDP, it exports and imports far more than any other country on the planet, including China. So it is certainly extensively globalized. And yet, wages in Germany are above the $20 an hour mark. They have extensive benefits, including full health care. They get 6 weeks of vacation, paid vacation per year, and job security, and so on and so forth. They have a sweetheart deal. How is that possible? How is that possible? Well, the argument goes, the reason is because of the nature in which labor unions are integrated into the decision-making process. And that process is such, and it's interesting, that it was imposed by the American government on the West German government after the Second World War, in essence to overcome the legacy of Nazi Germany. But basically what the American officials insisted is that in order to prevent the kind of corporate and state power that existed during Nazi Germany, every major corporation that employs more than 500 people in Germany has to have 49% representation of labor unions on their board of directors. Not 50%, not 51%, not a majority, but 49%. And the upshot of that is that they can't with that 49%, rule the company. They can't even really veto the actions of the companies. But what they can do is insist on having the books open to them. And that means that they are well aware of how those companies calculate their profits and how they calculate their investments. And the upshot is that the labor unions in Germany, for the most part, have gone along with things like outsourcing. They've recognized that outsourcing makes companies like VW, like Siemens, and so on more competitive globally, and is better for the economy as a whole. But they've insisted that insofar as Siemens or VW or BMW outsources a part of their operations, they have to spend an equivalent amount or invest an equivalent amount in the German economy to maintain their union membership at the same number and the employment level at the same number. And by doing so, they've maintained the same level of wages, the same level of benefits, and so on and so forth. That demonstrates, to some extent, the importance of institutions in determining the orientation of states toward trade. In that context, I also wanted to mention one other theory mentioned briefly in your textbook, and that is the Ricardo-Reiner model, which I think is in many ways much more useful in understanding trade issues than the two theories of comparative advantage that I mentioned before. In essence, what they noted is that when it comes to debates about free trade, those debates very rarely boil down to capital being in favor, labor being against, agriculture being in favor, labor being against. But instead, break down not in accordance to the factors of production, but rather according to the sector in which people are employed. So, for example, the argument goes that workers in the steel industry tend to see eye to eye on the issues of free trade with the interests of their employers. So if their employers are favorable to free trade, then chances are their workers will be as well. If their employers are against free trade, then chances are the workers will be as well. It's easy to understand why that would be the case. It's not so much that it eliminates the idea of class struggle or division of interest between labor and capital. It certainly does not. But what it does do is that it points to the fact that an industry that cannot compete globally and is subjected to free trade because of lower trade restrictions is likely to go bankrupt. And if it goes bankrupt, the workers are thrown out of work. And most workers tend to understand that. And consequently, whether they are in favor of free trade or not depends on their own perceptions of the extent to which their companies can compete in a free trade environment. If free trade opens up more markets to them and therefore increases employment in that sector, well, they're likely to be in favor of that, just as are the owners. If, on the other hand, competition from outside is likely to lead to shrinking profits and therefore shrinking employment in that sector, then again, they are likely to be inclined to go along with their employers on those interests. Let me talk about a couple of other quick things in regard to that. First of all, if it is the case that states invariably, on the whole, in the aggregate, benefit from free trade, even if certain segments are damaged by it, then it should be a relatively easy sale to say, we'll compensate those that are losing. If everyone is on the whole better off, if the economy is as a whole better off as a result of free trade, then it's a no-brainer. Tax some of the benefits that accrue disproportionately to one group and distribute them to those that are disproportionately damaged by that. And since the benefits, at least in theory, always outweigh the costs, it should be certainly fiscally responsible and possible to do so. That has, of course, on some occasions been done. But more prominently, political economists have argued that this is in effect what happened in the Western economies as a whole in the aftermath of the Second World War. In other words, that the institutions that emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War were part of a general negotiation, a kind of a social contract between the governments of developed states and their populations to allow for the liberalization of trade in return for being bought off or compensated for the instabilities that would cause. In other words, what emerged after 1945 with that great trade liberalization was the institutions of the welfare state. And the institutions of the welfare state offered first and foremost protection against unemployment. If you are thrown out of business because the company that you work for can't compete globally and therefore you have to find a new job, we at least give you a certain amount of time to find a new job, to retrain, and so on and so forth. There's also been extensive talk, particularly in the United States and in Canada to some extent, with regard to retraining. That insofar as that free trade is negotiated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that disproportionately affects employment in Ontario, for example, that the government has a responsibility to retrain those that lose their employment in automobile manufacturing or other manufacturing industries to allow them to reintegrate into the job market at a similar pay rate elsewhere. Unfortunately, of course, these arrangements of the welfare state have not survived in as robust of a form as they first emerged, in particular not in North America. The Europeans, for a variety of reasons, some of which I discussed, have been maintaining their welfare states in far better shape than North America, although they are currently coming under extreme pressure because of the austerity measures introduced in the European Union to address the economic crisis in Greece and elsewhere. Let me talk a little bit about how states get what they want. One of the problems with free trade, which is the case with regard to any international negotiations, as we discussed at length last term when talking about military conflicts and things along those lines, is trust. A lack of trust is one of the chief obstacles to negotiating free trade pacts. States invariably suspect that they will be held to account to the agreement that they sign, but that their partners may find ways of getting around it, may find ways of cheating. And that is a major stumbling block to the further development of free trade agreements. That states invariably accuse each other of cheating by subsidizing certain parts of their production and dumping the goods at a cost lower than what it costs to produce them in foreign markets. Why would a state ever dump something at a cost lower than what it costs them to produce it in a foreign market?
Isn't this a method of economic attack? Like you make your product so
well, there's two reasons, one of which is exactly what you're saying. It's kind of an economic sabotage.
you render it uncompetitive.
Exactly. You essentially undermine an industry in another country, and by doing so, essentially capture that market permanently. And once the competitors are eliminated, you then ramp up the prices again and make your profits back. It's a form of economic sabotage. Subsidies create an incentive for that kind of economic sabotage, basically because by subsidizing the production of a certain good, such as in the United States, corn production is heavily subsidized, and therefore corn prices are far lower in the United States than they are on world markets. And many have argued that the United States dumps large portions of that subsidized corn into foreign markets to achieve certain foreign policy goals. In some cases, in order to force those countries to specialize on export crops rather than on food production, by undermining the production of the ability to produce food domestically simply by lowering the price of food to such an extent that subsistence agriculture is no longer possible. And in other cases, in order to punish certain governments for misdeeds or to force them into line with American preferences. Another component we already talked about were non-tariff barriers and regulations, such as on hormones, GMOs, and so on. But all of these things, in many ways, resemble a kind of a prisoner's dilemma, in which states want to negotiate, but don't know whether their negotiating partner is going to cooperate or is ultimately going to cheat, is ultimately pulling out. The overall issue of trust and the prisoner's dilemma dynamic of these kinds of negotiations have had the result, on the one hand, of favoring relatively small free trade agreements over extremely large ones. NAFTA being a very good example of that. Of course, it started with the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States that then extended to Mexico. But in this case, there's only 3 actors. And those 3 actors are easier to monitor than a far larger free trade agreement involving a lot more players. As such, free trade agreements generally start out small, like NAFTA or Mercosur, or indeed the European Union, and if successful, start to have an appeal to their neighbors and become enlarged, as Mercosur has been, as the EU has been, and as NAFTA has attempted to do through the project of the Free Trade Area of the Americas that was initiated by the Bush administration, but that has gone up somewhat like a lead balloon, in large part because